Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending the session on climate change and nuclear war. I'd like to introduce the speakers. Our first speaker today is Dr. Pervez Amir Ali Hoodbhoy, who's a leading nuclear physicist, a public figure, and commentator. In 2011, he was included in the list of 100 most influential global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine. Since 2013, he is a member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Affairs. He is in conversation today with Dr. Zia Mia. Dr. Mia is a US-based physicist. He co-directs the program on science and global security at Princeton University. He is co-chair of the International Panel on Fissile Materials, a 17-country independent group of experts working to end production and to reduce and eliminate global stockpiles of highly enriched uranium and plutonium. He is also a recipient of the 2014 Linus Pauling Legacy Award for his accomplishments as a scientist and as a peace activist in contributing to the global effort for nuclear disarmament and for a more peaceful world. I'd like to welcome both of them on stage.
Well, thank you everyone for being here. You had much pleasanter alternatives, those that relate to literature, but yet you have come to spend your evening talking about something that is thoroughly unpleasant, nuclear war, and no less is climate change. I am very happy over here to be with my friend and colleague Zia Mia. As you heard in the introduction, he heads the program on science and global security at Princeton University, but I've known him for a very long time, since 1984, in fact, when he was teaching at Quaid-e-Azam University. And since then, we have been friends, and we tend to agree on most things, but there are lots of things that we don't agree on, and perhaps I will be therefore picking on those things that we do not agree upon. But Zia, I want to start with a question to you. The United States at one time had a very big movement to eliminate nuclear weapons, and in 1981 there were 1 million people at Central Park in New York asking for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Now, 30 years have passed since then. And today you have a president of the United States who is aggressive, who is perhaps of less than average intelligence. Certainly, an English teacher in the US has commented that his command over the English language is equivalent to that of an 8-year-old. With his finger on the nuclear button, how are people in the United States looking at the situation? Do you feel that there is scope for a movement on the scale that emerged in 1981 at the time of President Reagan?
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah? No? Is that better? Okay. All right. Still not good? No, still not good. You need to make it louder. All right. So thank you everybody for coming, and thank you to Pervez for deciding to pick a fight in public. But let me focus on his question about Trump. We are trying very hard right now to build the resistance against Trump in every field, whether it was the ban on immigrants and refugees from the 7 Muslim majority countries, to his plan to deport 11 million people, to build the wall, and certainly his policy on nuclear weapons and climate change. But on this question about building a mass movement against what Trump's nuclear weapons policy might be that would be similar to that of the early 1980s, the famous nuclear freeze movement, there is certainly a lot of anger and a lot of passion among people and a lot of fear. In the election campaign in particular, one of the most important elements in the public debate was about how reckless and irresponsible Trump may be when he is given charge of the nuclear weapons. But one of the things that's happened since the 1980s is that the fear of nuclear war has gone away because of the end of the Cold War. And one reason that the American peace movement went into decline is that after Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union agreed on major reductions in nuclear weapons and to end the Cold War, and agreed in principle to ban nuclear weapons, the peace movement thought, our job is done. The superpowers have agreed to get rid of nuclear weapons, so we can go away and focus on more important issues. And that neglect led to more than 20 years of a lack of attention being given to nuclear weapons. It's still not clear if the fear of Trump will be enough to replace the fear of nuclear war as the motive for a mass movement that can sustain the kind of effort that will be required. But there is 2 pieces of encouraging news. The first is that on the day that the election result was announced in the United States, that Trump is now going to be the president, one reporter went on television and said that he has now been told that generals in the US military are reading the American Constitution to see under what circumstances they could disobey President Trump. This is the level of their concern. Right? The second is that the fear of Trump having the finger on the nuclear button, as Pervez put it, is so intense that for the first time since nuclear weapons were invented by the United States, there is a bill that has been introduced into the US Congress that says this bill will take away the power from the President of the United States to launch nuclear weapons without consultation with Congress. This is an anti-Trump bill. The goal is to make sure that, if it's passed, that he cannot just start a nuclear war at 3 o'clock in the morning because he's angry about tweeting something.
Let me follow up on this. Trump has been called a nuclear monarch, somebody whose judgment, whose decisions cannot be questioned. Now, isn't this intrinsic to the whole idea of having a nuclear weapons deterrent, that it can be used without warning, without giving explanations, without saying who has decided to press the button? The command and control systems of every country are wrapped in layers and layers of secrecy. Like we in Pakistan don't really know who will make the final decision. It is most probably the Chief of Army Staff. In India, it is not known who will make that decision. But in the United States, which is the country that first had nuclear weapons, it too does not have a transparent command and control system. So how would such legislation, in fact, make the situation safer?
Well, what the legislation would seek to do is that right now the President of the United States has what's called the football. This is the famous black suitcase that the military officer carries with the President everywhere he goes, including into the elevator. He waits outside the bathroom, he sits outside his bedroom, so that at any time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year for 4 years, the President can within a minute or so open the suitcase and begin the process of launching nuclear weapons. That would be taken away. by this legislation. What it would do is that it would require the president to consult selected members of the Congress in advance of making any decision to launch. Now, this idea actually is a very old idea in the sense that it was first proposed during World War II, before the first atom bomb was ever used. When they were used on Japan, before they were used, a group of scientists warned the United States government that if you use the nuclear weapon on Japan without warning, there will be an arms race with the Soviet Union. Other countries will get nuclear weapons. The whole world will be at risk. You should not do this without thinking. And so they suggested that the United States find an empty island and invite the Japanese government to send observers and to test a nuclear weapon and let the Japanese see that we have built this terrible weapon and we will use it unless you surrender. And then the scientists said something very interesting. They said, if the Japanese do not surrender, you should go to the United Nations and ask for permission to use nuclear weapons. And you should go to the American people and ask permission to use nuclear weapons, because these nuclear weapons are so terrible that no government and no leader should do this without the consent of the international community and their own public opinion. The American government said, of course not. We will use them without asking anybody, and they did. And the scientists were proven right. There was an arms race with the Soviet Union. Other countries got nuclear weapons, and we have lived with the danger of the end of the world for 70 years. But now this question about how to control the use of nuclear weapons in the United States is re-emerging as a pivotal question, in large part because of Trump. And so the fact that members of Congress are willing to think about this, the fact that there will be members of the military who have publicly said, and these are people whose job it is to launch nuclear weapons, they have publicly said and signed letters saying that they are not comfortable with the idea of Trump alone having control over American nuclear weapons, is an enormous step.
I think they are following up on what the judges have done in the United States. They have blocked the executive order and said that no, the presidential directive is something that is illegal. It goes against the Constitution of the United States. But yeah, let's come back to this issue of lack of fear. Over time, people have learned to live with nuclear weapons. It's been 70 years or more since, 75 years since nuclear weapons have been first used. And there hasn't been nuclear war. And so people say, oh, well, if it hasn't happened since 1945, it's not going to happen again. 1981, which I referred to, was a high period in the mobilization of people. But now that's all over there. Let's come to Pakistan and India. In 1998, when India tested and then Pakistan tested 17 days later, there was a lot of fear at that time. Now you don't see the fear. Now, in fact, we see that there are belligerent statements coming from both sides. We had our defense minister, Khaja Asif, saying that nuclear weapons, what are they for if they're not to be used? And on the Indian side, we had Manohar Parrikar, who said that, what did he say? He said that we are going to rethink our no first use doctrine. So the rhetoric on both sides has heated up. But also the facts on the ground have changed. What do you think are the most important nuclear developments in this sense, which bring us to a higher level of confrontation, where this rhetoric also might matter?
Well, let me divide my answer about that into two parts. The first part is that think about the history that Parvez didn't talk about. And that is the period from 1945 to 1981. So 1945, the Americans make the first nuclear weapons and use the first nuclear weapons. But it's not until the 1980s, almost 40 years later, that you get the kind of mass movement that finally forced the government of the United States and the Soviet Union to say, okay, we accept the demand of the public that nuclear weapons are very dangerous. We need to cut them back and agree in principle to the abolition of nuclear weapons. So it took an almost 40-year period of crisis and fear and public education and a particularly troubling political leader for all of this to actually reach that point. Pakistan and India are still in the romantic period of their relationship with nuclear weapons. Right? They still think that these are high-tech, even though they are 70-year-old technology. They think that they are powerful rather than a great curse. They think that this will make them strong as opposed to making them a target that will end their countries. And it takes time for governments and people going through crisis and having a peace movement and having scientists and other people explain to them patiently and systematically just how dangerous nuclear weapons are before people start asking the right questions. Do I want to be defended if the cost of that defense is the end of my country forever? What political goal is worth ending your country forever and killing all of your people? Once you put it in that way, people start to ask, why were we not told before? And this is eventually what happened with the United States and the Soviet Union. So the fact that Pakistan and India still have this relationship with nuclear weapons and are not questioning their dangers is no surprise. The fact of the matter is that the rest of the world looks at Pakistan, having gone through that experience, and is deeply troubled by the kinds of developments of nuclear arsenals that they see in both countries. So India is testing its first nuclear-powered submarine to be able to launch nuclear weapons from the ocean. Pakistan has carried out its first test of a cruise missile to be launched from a submarine underwater. Pakistan has also tested tactical nuclear weapons, the Nasr, to use on the battlefield against Indian tanks. And I was in a meeting in Washington, D.C., like this one, where instead of talking to my friend Parvez Udbhoy, I was talking to the Indian military officer who was previously in charge of India's nuclear weapons. His name was Admiral Shankar. And we were talking about Pakistan and India's nuclear weapons and the risks. And he said, oh, Pakistan's nuclear weapons are very dangerous. I said, yeah, but so are yours. And he said, but Pakistan will use them first. I said, okay, they will use them first, but Pakistan says they will use them first against Indian tanks and soldiers. And I said, then what will you do? And he said, the Indian nuclear doctrine is completely clear that an attack with nuclear weapons on Indian forces anywhere will be met with massive retaliation. I said, so let me understand completely what you are saying. That if Pakistan uses its Nasr nuclear weapon against Indian tanks, even if those tanks have crossed into Pakistan, you will retaliate. How will you retaliate? He said, massive retaliation. I said, what is massive retaliation? Will you attack Pakistan cities? He said, yes. I said, in public audience, the recording is available, that are you saying that you will use nuclear weapons against Karachi, Islamabad, Lahore, Rawalpindi, if Pakistan uses nuclear weapons on Indian tanks? He said, yes. And if you ask yourself, what does that mean? That means Pakistan will use nuclear weapons and try and destroy a few hundred tanks. It actually takes a lot of nuclear weapons to destroy tanks, especially when the other side has been training and practicing for that possibility. And the Indians have been practicing for the possible use of nuclear weapons by Pakistan against their tanks for many years. So they know how to deal with that kind of attack. So Pakistan will not actually be able to kill many Indian tanks. But the Indian retaliation will be against Pakistani cities, which will kill tens of millions of people.
And of course, there would be a retaliation from this side, which would then level Indian cities as well. And so there would be no winners in that confrontation. But let's come to this issue of tactical nuclear weapons in some detail. This goes back to 2008, as you very well know. This was when the Mumbai attacks took place. India was unable to do anything, although it felt that the attackers had come from Pakistan. And subsequently, there was a Indian army doctrine that was formulated called cold start. General Deepak Kapoor, who was the head of the Indian Armed Forces at that time, said that India must have the capacity to fight two wars at the same time and to come into Pakistan and chop it into what he called salami slices. This then gave the impetus to Pakistan to develop the Nasr missile and then to develop the whole idea that an Indian invasion would be countered by the use of nuclear weapons, as you said. But then cold start was sort of denied. It was ambivalent. It was said to be not an official doctrine of the Indian Army. But now, just 2 months ago, we had the new Indian Chief of Army Staff, General Bipin, who said that, yes, cold start is very much alive. So how do you, how are you looking at this?
So one has to see this question about tactical weapons and India and tanks and cold start in a slightly more complicated way. The first part of this is that if you think back to the origin of Pakistan's nuclear weapons, there was always an element that Pakistan was going to use its nuclear weapons against Indian tanks and troops, simply for the reason that India had more tanks and troops. So this tactical use of nuclear weapons by Pakistan was always an element of Pakistani nuclear thinking. It did not begin with Nasr. The second part is that the Indian cold start doctrine was an army doctrine. The Indian Air Force never believed it and didn't really support it. And neither did the political leadership. There's no evidence that the Indian cabinet or the Indian Prime Minister actually agreed to cold start. It was an army plan made by the army because it felt useless in the context of, after the Mumbai attack, the Indians sent lots and lots of soldiers to the Pakistani border and nothing happened. And the Indian army was shown effectively to be useless in that situation as an instrument of military power. So the Indian army had to come up with a justification for its existence, for its budget, for its role, and they came up with cold start. Time has passed since 2008, and what's happened is that the new Indian army chief wants more money for the Indian army. He wants more tanks, he wants better weapons, and so he needs a justification for political support. And so he has picked up cold start again to say, oh, we can do this. Nobody believes the Indian army is actually capable of conducting the kind of military operation that cold start would involve. Every independent analyst that has actually looked at Indian military capability doesn't believe this. The problem is that the Indian army likes to try and make the case that it can do a cold start kind of attack, and the Pakistan army likes the idea of cold start because it means that they then feel justified in having their own big army with lots of tanks and of having nuclear weapons to stop those tanks. So every time the Indians say cold start, the Pakistan army says, aha, you see? We have a justification for our own big army and our own tactical nuclear weapons. And so nobody else takes cold start that seriously, but it serves the Pakistani army's political purpose to be able to lend credence to cold start. And for those of you who think that this is a strange argument, if you go back and look at the history of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, you see exactly the same logic playing out with those two states. That in the middle of nuclear confrontation, one side would come up with an argument that was only for a bureaucratic interest, and the other side would like that argument because it gave them a bureaucratic interest also. The arms race served militaries on both sides in terms of increasing budgets and capabilities. And so they liked this idea. And we are in exactly the same situation here now, that arms racing is good for armies.
Tactical nuclear weapons, they are, first of all, just for the benefit of those who are not used to this kind of terminology, strategic nuclear weapons are those that are aimed at cities or at population centers, and they generally tend to be bigger. Whereas tactical nuclear weapons tend to be smaller and they are aimed against army formations, tanks, and so forth. Now, the idea of fighting a tactical nuclear war, as you very well know, is not new. It goes back to the Cold War. And in fact, as early as 1955 or so, the United States had developed nuclear weapons that were so small that they could be launched by 2 infantrymen. They could carry that nuclear weapon on their shoulders and launch it from Turkey into what was then the USSR. So now we have taken over that doctrine in a sense, but now we also have to remember why the United States retreated from that. And that's because once you leave the decision up to military commanders, or 2 infantrymen for that matter, then what if those guys are in a bad mood? And look at our missiles, Nasr missile, it'll be in the hands of a brigadier. And the brigadier might have had a fight with his wife that day, or whatever. What do you say about the stabilizing effect of nuclear submarines and compare that to tactical nuclear weapons? I say stabilizing. I don't like them, but this is an argument that's been made for very long, that if you have weapons which are hidden and they have the capability of striking from some place where they cannot be found, then it'll be assured that the other country will be destroyed, and so a nuclear war will not start.
The captain of the nuclear submarine may have the same problems with his wife as the brigadier. Right? So the problem is the nuclear weapons, no matter where they are. And this was something that people realized a long time ago. And so you put in as many complicated systems to try and prevent the unauthorized and uncontrolled use of nuclear weapons by the military people who you have given them to. Because ultimately you know that, you can't really trust these people just by giving them the weapons. So you put in secret codes, and then you send them the code, and without the code, they can't get the nuclear weapon ready to launch. What this is telling you is that the political leadership did not trust the military not to go off and start a nuclear war. Whether they are in the submarine, whether they are in the aeroplane, whether they are in the silo underground, or whether they are holding tactical nuclear weapons. In all cases, but it took until the 1970s, from 1945 until the late 1960s, before the Americans actually had good enough controls to put on the nuclear weapons to make sure that the military officers did not just start a nuclear war. So this lack of trust between political decision makers and militaries is fine in a democracy like the United States. The Soviet Union had its own system of controls. I mean, they were not democratic, but the Communist Party did not trust the Soviet army and the Soviet Navy not to start a nuclear war. They had their own system of controls. The question is, in Pakistan, we have the problem that the soldiers are in charge of the system from the beginning to the end. And this is historically unique. Among all of the states with nuclear weapons, in China, it is the Communist Party in control, not the People's Liberation Army. Even in North Korea, it is the party that is in control, not the North Korean military. In Pakistan, we are alone among all nuclear weapons throughout the history of the nuclear age, where the Faujis are in charge of the weapons.
Although in strictly textual terms, you could be challenged because the Nuclear Command Authority has the President of Pakistan as the head of the NCA. But that's, I think, by the way. We know that the President really is not the most important person in this country.
Well, let me just, that's half an answer. The rest of the answer is no other nuclear weapon state has ever had a coup where the army has seized power successfully.
Let's move on. Climate change. Nobody was talking about it 20 years ago. Everybody is talking about it now. What's changed and how bad is it going to get and how fast?
How bad is it going to get and how fast? Well, that's still unknown because we actually have a treaty, the Paris Agreement, where countries have agreed to limit the emissions of the gases that produce global warming. And so we have a path to control the scope of possible climate change that is yet to happen if those countries actually take their obligation seriously. The fact that we have reached an agreement is an enormous achievement because people have been trying to agree on a treaty to limit climate change for a very long time. But what is uncertain is how the process of implementing the treaty will work. And here we come back to President Trump. President Trump actually has said publicly that there is no such thing as climate change. It is a Chinese conspiracy. A Chinese conspiracy. And it's done by China, he says, for trade reasons. That China is trying to slow down American economic growth by using climate change as an excuse. There is no such thing as climate change. And the Secretary of State he has appointed is the former head of an oil company. And one of the first commitments he has made is to start increasing coal production and oil production and gas production in the United States and prevent any restriction on the emission of greenhouse gases. Now, the United States is the second largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world. China is the largest. The United States used to be the largest, but no longer. And so if the United States withdraws from the Paris Agreement or shows no sign of trying to meet its obligations, then it's quite possible other countries will also not take their obligations seriously. In which case, there will be very rapid increases in greenhouse gases and therefore much more severe climate change than would otherwise be the case. But even if there is some degree of restraint, we're already expecting a more than 2 degree centigrade rise in temperature. And with that, there will already be large-scale disruption of the environment. So that part is already certain. The question is whether it becomes 4 degrees or higher in due course. And that's something that is yet to be decided and will depend on how the world reacts to Trump and controlling their own emissions.
Well, I think of course, it's certainly true that the United States is now the second greatest producer of greenhouse gases, but other countries in the world are also producing them, and they're producing them in larger and larger amounts every year, that rate of production is still going up. If you look at China, China today is the greatest producer of greenhouse gases, and it is also suffering the consequences of pollution. The air quality in Beijing is the poorest in the whole world. If you look at Delhi, it's possibly the most polluted capital other than Beijing. I was there just earlier last month in fact, and it was hard for me to breathe. But then when I came back to Lahore, it didn't improve very much. So this is not just a problem of the United States, this is a problem that is global, and so what's needed is the rise of a global consciousness. How do we get that global consciousness?
That global consciousness is already there. Right? It's just not uniformly distributed among all people everywhere. Right? But this is the same of other kinds of global consciousness. Right? Most people around the world believe in some elementary ideas of equality, that all people are equal. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, male or female, that you are basically human beings and all human beings should be equal. Now, we still know that there are people who are racists. There are people who discriminate on the basis of religion and think that just because you are a different religion, you are not a full human being. There are people who think that women are not equal to men. But that doesn't mean that there is not a broadly accepted global sense that, yes, equality is actually the right way to think about things. And there are many other principles that are actually widely shared. One of the problems that we face with an issue like climate change, and coming back to our previous discussion about nuclear weapons and nuclear war, is that something gets in the way of turning your idea about being human and caring about the world, which most people do, and caring about your environment, gets in the way of giving that the priority it deserves. And what gets in the way of that when it comes to nuclear weapons is ideas of nationalism and national defense, that you should do these things like have nuclear weapons because defending your country is worth it. And the idea that it's okay to kill millions and millions of people is then put to one side. Similarly with climate change, the idea that you want to be rich, that you want to be prosperous, for which you need big industry, lots of energy to drive your economy forward, in which case then it's okay to pollute the planet and to pollute your cities and to contaminate your environment with all kinds of chemicals and pollutants, even though it is bad for your health. But the fact is you get to drive a nice car and have air conditioning. Right? I mean, this is what gets in the way of you actually being rational about what is good for you. Right? And we see this all over the world. The people who voted for Trump think the same way, even though they have every opportunity to be enlightened. And you see these divisions in the United States, in Western Europe, in other countries, about how to deal with issues of defense and how to deal with issues of environment and development. So it's not particular.
Should we give the audience a chance to ask questions now? Okay, good. Is there a microphone that can be carried around? Here? नहीं इनको दीजिए इनको दीजिए Can you introduce yourself?
Good evening. I'm Sayyid Shamsuddin. Previously, I was Human Rights Commission working for. Before that, I was working for Amnesty in Pakistan. So, before this program, starting this program, I request Bhai Sahab that we should discuss this debate in Urdu language. But we also agreed. But I don't know. But I have learned Zia Sahab so many times previously. But then,
अच्छा, आप चाहते हैं कि यहाँ उर्दू में गुफ्तगू
नहीं,
हो?
उर्दू अंग्रेजी नहीं, मैं चाह रहा हूँ कि जो जितने लोग बैठे हुए हैं, जो माइक्रोफोन सीट कर रहे हैं और जो आसपास बैठे हुए हैं सफाई कर रहे हैं, उस डिबेट को समझें, इस डिबेट को समझें कि हम क्या कर रहे हैं, हम क्या बात कर रहे हैं. जो मैं कहता हूँ इस महफिल में गालिबन 1% भी लोग नहीं इसको फॉलो कर रहे हैं. मेरा मकसद ये कि 99.9% लोग जो बैठे हुए हैं ना प्रोग्राम को अटेंड कर रहे हैं, जो सवाई कर रहे हैं, इस बात को समझें. अच्छा मेरा सवाल ये है, चले खैर इस बात उर्दू अंग्रेज़ी को छोड़ देते हैं. ये बताइए कि हिंदुस्तान और पाकिस्तान दोनों न्यूक्लियर स्टेट हैं. ज़िया मोदी साहब मैं सुन चुका हूँ आपको इस्लामाबाद में, और मैं आपसे बहुत मुतासिर हूँ.
सवाल कीजिए.
परवेज साहब हमारे, अच्छा मेरा सवाल ये है कि दोनों के पास न्यूक्लियर बटन है, पाकिस्तान के पास, इंडिया के पास, तो इसके बावजूद ये हर साल 10% जो बजट मिलिट्री का बजट बढ़ रहा होता है, ये क्यों है?
अच्छा, सवाल ये है कि
अच्छा मेरा दोनों से सवाल है, अगर ज़िया साहब को समझ नहीं आ रहा है तो आप इनको समझा दें.
जी 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 जी
हर साल
जी, बात समझ में आ गई. जी, आपका सवाल ये है कि अगर आपके पास 10 हैं तो फिर उससे ज़्यादा की ज़रूरत क्यों है? देखिए, जो हमारे जनरल साहिबान हैं और उस तरफ जो जनरल साहिबान हैं ना, वो कहते हैं कि हमारे पास 10 काफ़ी नहीं है, 10 से अगर आप 50 कर लें वो भी काफ़ी नहीं है, 50 से 500 कर दें, इसकी तो कोई हद है नहीं. अब आप ये देखिए कि सर्द जंग के दौरान सोवियत यूनियन के पास 35,000 न्यूक्लियर वेपन्स थे और अमेरिका के पास तकरीबन 30,000. आखिर इसकी क्या ज़रूरत थी? अगर ये सारे न्यूक्लियर वेपन इस्तेमाल होते तो पूरी दुनिया को ये 7 मरतबा तबाह कर सकते. अब एक दफ़ा काफ़ी नहीं है. अब देखिए, आपके सवाल का असल में कोई जवाब इसलिए नहीं दिया जा सकता कि ये जो फ़ौजी जर्नैल हैं और जो न्यूक्लियर वेपन बनाने से फ़ायदा हासिल करते हैं, वो कहते हैं कि देखो अगर तुमने 5 बनाए तो हो सकता है कि उनमें से 4 तबाह हो जाएं, कि उनके पास एंटी बैलिस्टिक मिसाइल है या कोई उन्होंने एक ऐसा तरीक़ा ईजाद किया जिससे आपके न्यूक्लियर वेपन तबाह हो जाएंगे, लिहाजा आपको ज़्यादा की ज़रूरत होगी. अब इसकी एक वो कहते हैं कि ये बिल्कुल एक मंतकी जवाब है, लेकिन दरअसल ये बात गलत है. असल बात ये है कि इससे बनाने वालों का फ़ायदा होता है, वहाँ मुलाजमतें बनती हैं, वहाँ मुनाफा कमाया जा सकता है वगैरह. तो ये एक बड़ी ये एक पुराना मर्ज़ है और ये शायद एक लाइलाज मर्ज़ है.
So let me add one thing to this answer, and that is that if you look at every nuclear weapon state, the Air Force has nuclear weapons, the Army has nuclear weapons, and the Navy has nuclear weapons. And each time that one gets them, then the other military service wants it. And then the other military service wants it. And so there is competition within militaries that if nuclear weapons are going to be important, then we do not want our service not to be important. And so as a consequence, and now in Pakistan, you can't see the internal debate. But in the United States, all the documents are now available from the early years of the Cold War, and you can read that when the first American nuclear weapons were made, only the Air Force had them. And the American Navy was so worried that if nuclear weapons will finish wars, then who will need the Navy? So they said, oh, the Navy has to have nuclear weapons. And the Army said that if the Army doesn't have nuclear weapons, who will need soldiers? If the Air Force can win the war, or the Navy can win the war, who needs an army? The army has to have nuclear weapons. And so this is exactly what happened elsewhere. And now you are seeing this in Pakistan and India also. Now the Pakistan Air Force has nuclear weapons, the Pakistan Army has nuclear weapons, and now the Pakistan Navy has nuclear weapons, because nobody wants to feel left out.
जी.
And I'm doing my A-levels in free engineering as my major subjects. My question is from Dr. Parvez. It's about one of the articles that I came across on a social media website. It stated that Pakistan, that many problems that Pakistan is faced with, one of them is terrorism. And since many of your articles that I've read are concerning radical Islamists and how Pakistan's integrity is threatened by radical Islamists and a general, extremist mindset. So my question from you is, the article stated that the bigger problem than terrorism is climate change. Like the biggest problem of Pakistan is climate change and not terrorism. So it is a very important question that is borne in my mind, and I will want you to shed some light on this important topic, or I would want to know about your views, like what would you say about this statement that I have actually come across?
Well, it's, I think, to say that climate change is more important than terrorism may not be true right now, but it is going to become true in another few years. Maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years, because at that time we are going to be faced with a decreasing supply of water principally, increased pollution, poisoned land, urban explosion of population, and that is going to be much more devastating than terrorism itself. But I think Zia has something to say on this, because he has often said that nuclear weapons and terrorism are just as dangerous and must be taken up together.
So one of the things that you have to understand is that climate change creates social stress. Right? It doesn't just change the climate, it changes patterns of rainfall, it will melt the Himalayan glaciers, it will reduce the water in the Indus River, it will reduce the amount of electricity that can be produced by hydroelectric dams. You will not be able to predict when it will rain or how much it will rain in the same way. The ground will dry out, and therefore there will be more often droughts, floods, failures of agriculture, food shortages, electricity shortage, and all of this in a system of politics and society that is already at war with itself. So if you think you have a problem with terrorism now, when climate change comes fully, it will just multiply all of those problems manyfold. So terrorists may kill you today, but 20 years of climate change, there will be a lot more pressure driving people into violent kinds of politics, because society here is fundamentally unjust and unfair and undemocratic in so many ways. And so eventually, if there is no better solution, people will use force.
There's a little story that I want to tell you. It's about two frogs. One frog fell into a pot of hot water, and just as the water struck him, he jumped out. The other frog was in water on a stove, and the stove slowly heated up the water. He felt something changing, but he wasn't alarmed enough. And so it got hot enough and he died. Climate change is coming upon us slowly. Terrorism is something that strikes you bang, head on. And you can do more about terrorism than you can do about climate change, frankly. Yes, sir. And then I'll come.
अस्सलामुअलैकुम, मेरा नाम मोहसिन है सर. मेरा क्वेश्चन ये है कि बेसिकली टुडे वर्ल्ड इज़ टेक्नोलॉजी वर्ल्ड, तो साइबर वार चलती है दुनिया में, साइबर वार्स होती हैं. तो ये जितने भी बम्स हैं ये यूज़फुल हो पाएंगे या इनको डिफ्यूज़ कर देंगे साइबर टेक्नोलॉजी उनको, और ये बिल्कुल ही एक नाकारा चीज़ बन के रह जाएंगे. और सेकंड थिंग दिस के हमारी स्टेट हमें कहती रही कि रशिया जो है वो हमारा दुश्मन है और ये है, और आज ही हम उनसे गर्म पानी क्या वसूल कर रहे हैं.
जी, बड़ा अच्छा सवाल है. देखिए, आजकल हर चीज़ जो है वो कंप्यूटर पर चलती है, लेकिन कंप्यूटर के अंदर सॉफ्टवेयर होता है. उस सॉफ्टवेयर के अंदर वायरस घुस सकता है. उस वायरस के घुसने से वो कंप्यूटर नाकारा हो सकता है, या वो غلط انسٹرکشنز دے سکتا ہے. اور یہ ایک بہت بڑا خطرہ ہے کہ جہاں آپ کے نیوکلیئر پاور پلانٹس ہیں, مثال کے طور پر یہ جو ہاکس بے کے نزدیک بن رہا ہے, ظاہر ہے کہ اس کے اندر کمپیوٹر ہوں گے, اور اب ساری دنیا میں ایک خطرہ پیدا ہو گیا ہے کہ سائبر وارفیئر کے ذریعے سے نیوکلیئر پاور پلانٹس میں ایسی خرابی پیدا کی جا سکتی ہے کہ یا تو وہ بند ہو جائیں یا پھر پھٹ پڑیں. تو اس کا حل کسی کی سمجھ میں اب تک نہیں آیا ہے. اور جو دوسری بات ہے جو آپ نے کی نیوکلیئر ویپنز کے حوالے سے, وہاں بھی یہی مسئلہ ہے کہ جو کوڈز ہیں, آخر اب ہر چیز جو ہے وہ ڈیٹا کے ذریعے سے, آپ کے جو موبائل ہیں اس کے اندر طرح طرح کے چپس ہیں, یہی چپس, اسی طرح کے چپس نیوکلیئر ویپنز کے اندر لگتے ہیں. اور اب ان چپس میں اگر وائرس کے ذریعے سے کوئی خرابی پیدا کی جائے تو پھر اس کے جو نتائج ہیں اس کے بارے میں بس ہم سوچ ہی سکتے ہیں.
میرا نام محمد بابر ہے. میں ضیاء میاں صاحب سے چاہوں گا تھوڑی سی بات اس پہ کرنا. آپ نے زیادہ تر تو جو بات کی وہ سرکاروں کے متعلق ہے, وہ ریاستوں سے متعلق ہے, اور جو ریاستیں ہیں ان کے بارے میں تو ہم بہت حد تک جانتے ہیں کہ یہ بہت سارے ہیومن رائٹس کے پیکٹ سائن کر کے آتے ہیں اور پھر یہاں آ کے ہزاروں لوگوں کو ایک ایک دن میں غائب کر دیں اور مسخ شدہ کر کے سڑکوں پہ پھینک دیتے ہیں, لیکن اسی وقت میں وہ ان پیکٹس پہ برابر سائن بھی کیے جا رہے ہوتے ہیں. وہ خواہ کلائمیٹ چینج کا سوال ہو, وہ نیوکلیئر ویپن کو ڈیفیوز کرنے کا سوال ہو, یہ مطلب سب چیزوں میں وہ یہی کر رہے ہیں. سوال یہ ہے کہ یہاں پہ لوگوں کا جو کنٹریبیوشن ہے وہ کہاں گیا. وہ جو 81 میں جو ہے امریکہ میں جو لوگ سڑکوں پر آئے تھے وہ اب کہاں ہیں لوگوں کے اندر. یعنی کہ ہم ہی یہاں جو بیٹھے ہوئے لوگ ہیں, کراچی کے ماحول کو تباہ کرنے والا ایک پروجیکٹ جو یہاں سے 20-25 کلومیٹر دور بحریہ ٹاؤن کے نام سے لگا اور اس نے کسانوں کے ساتھ جو کچھ کیا, لیکن ہم ہی ہیں جو وہاں انویسٹر ہیں, ہم ہی سے سب لوگ ہیں. ٹھیک ہے, تو ہم لوگوں کا اس ساری چیز میں کیا ہے, لوگ اس کو کیوں ریسپونڈ نہیں کر رہے, اور کیا وے آؤٹ ہے اس میں سے. کیونکہ جب تک لوگ ریسپونڈ نہیں کریں گے تو اسٹیٹس جو ہیں وہ جتنے مرضی پیکٹ سائن کر دے جائیں اس سے تو کوئی توقع نہیں کی جا سکتی.
You are absolutely right. But that's not a question. The answer we know. And the answer is that people have to take power in their own society. If you want a government that responds to your needs, then you have to find people and put them in government. I mean, this is what democracy is all about. I mean, what you're asking for is a government that respects the wishes of its people. This is true everywhere. And the fact that Pakistan has this problem doesn't make Pakistan unique. India has the same problem. The Chinese have the same problem. There are huge demonstrations in China against industrial projects, against the government seizing the land from farmers, destroying their houses, polluting their factories and their land. The Chinese government spends more money on its police force than on its army because of the level of internal unrest. The United States also has huge problems, and those problems are going to get worse. This is fundamentally what politics is all about. If you want to change what happens, you have to get into politics. You have to make political parties, make trade unions, make NGOs, create political workers, put people in office, elect them to the Sindh Assembly, the National Assembly, and pass the laws that you want. This is the only way this actually ever gets sorted out.
اور اس کے لیے ہمیں شعور بیدار کرنا ہوگا. مختصر یہ اوکے.
My name is Asad. Thank you so much for coming here. It's been fascinating hearing you. We talked earlier about Trump as a very irresponsible person as a commander-in-chief, which might give some people the idea that there was a time when we had a responsible storage movement and the general outkeep of nuclear weapons. That there were not times in history when, due to the mistakes at tactical or mid-strategic level, we did not come close to an all-out nuclear war between USA and Russia. The fact that we haven't had one also adds credence to that idea. So could you share some information about the mishaps that have happened and whether we should be worried about them from states like Pakistan and India in the future, or is it a false alarm or a false fear? Thank you.
So, Trump is the first president who has publicly said, why do we have them if we can't use them? Every other president, except for President Truman, the very first one, had the good sense to keep quiet about this question. Right? But Trump, why do we have them if we can't use them? This worries people. And the second thing is that Trump likes the idea of nuclear weapons as bargaining cards. That in a crisis you threaten to go nuclear to get the answer that you want. He said this publicly. But in terms of this larger question about previous situations, he's not the first president in the United States to scare people. There's a famous story about Richard Nixon, that when he was president, there was a period in his presidency where he was under investigation for crimes that his administration had committed, Watergate in particular, and he was drinking a lot as president, to the point where the people in his cabinet called the generals and said that if the president tells you to launch nuclear weapons, ask us first. Right? So there is a concern in the past also, but that was only because this was supposed to be an aberration with Nixon. Trump, this is his everyday life.
Well, okay.
Sir, my name is Zafar Baloch from University of Karachi. Sir, جیسے کہ ہم اگر پاکستان کی بات کریں تو سر یہاں پہ جو نیوکلر آرسنالز ہے اینڈ there is no secret کہ پاکستان has been and is home to both ironically good and bad طالبانس. تو سر جب نیوکلر آرسنالز کی بات ہے تو یہاں پہ آپ کو کتنی انسیکیورٹی نظر آتی ہے کہ is there anything critical as far as this situation is concerned?
دیکھیے یہ سوال بہت جگہوں پر کیا گیا ہے اور باہر کی دنیا بہت پریشان ہے کہ اگر جہادیوں کے ہاتھ یہ نیوکلیر ویپنز لگ گئے تو کیا یہ ان کو اغوا کر اس سے کہیں پر تباہی تو نہیں مچائیں گے, کہیں جا کر یہ اگر پھاڑ دیں تو اس کے بعد تو ہر طرف بربادی پھیلے گی اور شاید ایک نیوکلیر جنگ بھی اس کے نتیجے میں شروع ہو جائے. آپ کے سوال کا جواب دینا بڑا مشکل ہے. میں آپ کو یہ بتاتا ہوں کہ جب یہ سوال فوج سے کیا جاتا ہے تو وہ کہتے ہیں کہ کوئی فکر کی بات نہیں ہے, ہم نے ہر طرف باڑیں لگائی ہوئی ہیں, وہاں ہم نے ایسے تالے لگائے ہیں جو الیکٹرانک ہیں, ہم نے پرمیسو ایکشن لنکس کا بندوبست کیا ہے, اور اب جو بھی اسٹریٹجک پلانز ڈویژن SPD میں بھرتی ہوتا ہے ہم اس کی سائیکولوجیکل اسکریننگ کرتے ہیں جس سے ہمیں پتہ چل جاتا آیا کہ یہ دہشت گرد ہے کہ نہیں. اب مسئلہ یہ ہے کہ اگر کوئی دہشت گرد ہو تو وہ یہ تو نہیں کہے گا کہ میں اس ادارے کے اندر گھس رہا ہوں اس ارادے سے کہ میں ادھر سے کوئی بم چوری کرنے کا ارادہ کروں. لہٰذا اگرچہ وہ بہت وثوق سے کہتے ہیں کہ نہیں کبھی ایسے نہیں ہو سکتا, لیکن دنیا اب بھی پریشان ہے, اور سچی بات یہ ہے کہ جس طرح کے لوگ ہماری فوج میں اور ہمارے اداروں میں ہیں, ہاں کچھ جو ہیں وہ تو جہادیوں کے خلاف جہاد کرتے ہیں, لیکن کچھ ایسے ہیں جو ان کے ساتھ بھی ہیں, اور یہ تو کوئی چھپی بھی بات نہیں.
My name is Zulkarnain and I work for School Education Department, Government of Sindh. So I just have this question. So we know about nuclear weapons and it's like something not really new to us anymore. यहाँ तक कि climate change के हवाले से अगर उसका impact भी अगर समझने की कोशिश की जाए तो उसका भी हवाला nuclear weapon के एतबार से दिया जाता है कि जो अभी Global Risks Report World Economic Forum की 2017 की है कि उसमें ये बताया गया है कि अगर सालाना स्पिल अगर हम सालाना अगर देखें कि कितना हीट ट्रैप करने वाले जो पोल्यूटेंट्स हम एयर में रिलीज़ करते हैं तो जो हिरोशिमा पे बॉम्ब गिराया गया था 400,000 टाइम्स जो हीट उसमें से निकली थी वो उतनी हीट डेली ऑलमोस्ट जो है वो ट्रैप होती है बिकॉज ऑफ द पोल्यूटेंट्स दैट वी रिलीज बट द थिंग इज ड्यूरिंग द डिस्कशन अ लॉट वाज डिस्कस्ड अबाउट ट्रम्प द नॉनसेंसिकल स्टेटमेंट्स दैट ही हैज़ बीन कमिंग अप विद एंड द थ्रेट दैट वी नाउ फेस कि nuclear war probably start hogi. But prior to Trump, Obama had a couple of agreements that he signed with India. For example, new defense framework, and then America's long age-old attempt of enabling India to enter into nuclear suppliers group. So all of these things and the political maneuvering that is happening, don't you think that itself leads to threat perception among nations, and then this threat perception is linked with nuclear arms race? So is there really anything that's happening, or it's just mere rhetoric? So that's my question.
That's a very important question. I'll ask Zia to answer it.
So, I find it funny that Pakistan is now so upset that the Americans are doing security relationship with India. Baba, we had a 50-year security relationship with the United States, and then it was perfectly fine. Right? Pakistan signed the first military alliance agreement with the United States of any South Asian country. Right? Military assistance agreement back in the 1950s. Yeah? And joined military alliances, and American soldiers came, and there were bases and this and that and the other. And then it was all perfectly legitimate and perfectly fine. If you don't want foreign powers interfering in your defense politics, then you should make an agreement not to make military alliances with anyone. So if Pakistan says, we are willing to commit not to have military alliances with anyone, including China, then you can have the basis to talk to the Indians. Why don't you give up your military alliances that you want to make with the United States? We can live without military alliances, but then everybody has to do this. You have to remember, Pakistan started this military alliance nonsense. The Americans first went to Jawaharlal Nehru and said, do you want to be on our side in the Cold War? And Nehru said, we did not become independent to become your client. And Pakistan said, oh sir, we are with you. Right? And from this, so many of our problems begin. So you are absolutely right. Perceptions matter. But fundamentally, the question is, are you committed to either living with your neighbors, because they will always be your neighbors, or trying to seek advantage through military alliances of finding some big bully to come be on your side? If you do that, then yes, you create problems.
There was another part to that question about the nuclear suppliers group, which needs to be answered. And I think, this is my personal opinion, that both India and Pakistan should be allowed to membership into the nuclear suppliers group, provided A, they don't make more nuclear weapons, B, they don't test any more nuclear weapons, and C, they don't make quantitative jumps such as they're making now, submarine-launched cruise missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and so forth. If they agree to this, I say, sure, let both countries become members of the NSG.
Okay, so now I will disagree with him. It's been 1 hour, so I can disagree with him. The nuclear suppliers group is redundant and useless, and nobody should want to be a member. Right? It is a 1950s vintage technology, nuclear reactors. It's the most complicated and expensive way to boil water that human beings have ever invented. That's all they are. They are giant kettles to boil water to make electricity. They are so expensive that nobody who actually invests their own money is building nuclear power plants. The only countries building nuclear power plants are where governments, which have government departments to make nuclear power plants, are making them. So the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians and the Pakistanis. The Americans, they can't even find an American company to build a nuclear power plant anymore. The British, the Chinese are paying for it. So the fact of the matter is, the best thing to do would be for India and Pakistan to realize that you are much better off having your electricity from wind power and solar power instead of wanting to be members of this old, useless, dangerous technology system, and say thank you very much both to the Chinese and to the Americans and say goodbye, we will manage it ourselves in a perfectly safe way.
Okay, we have just 1 minute left, so one question. Maybe I'll take someone from the very back over there. As far back as you can go, just to even up things.
Hello. My question is directed at both of you. I would like to give a disclaimer to the fact that I do not have much knowledge of the sciences, but my question will eventually lead there. My question is in two parts. The first being, living in the 21st century, do you guys think 100% nuclear proliferation is possible in nation states in general, given the evolution of terrorism and proxy wars? And if not, how much do you think is the responsibility of scientists to divert public focus on to bigger things for these nuclear arsenals, like the renewed space age and space fission, nuclear fission for space travel and related things? Thank you.
Okay, look, the short answer of that is that you don't need scientists to build nuclear weapons anymore. This is now just an engineering problem. Once upon a time, making nuclear weapons required deep knowledge of physics and of nuclear physics in particular. Now it's all there on the internet, in textbooks, and if you have a reasonably well-educated engineering team, it can put together a simple nuclear weapon without too much trouble, provided it has access to fissile material, the stuff that goes into the bomb. Even a country like North Korea has managed to make a bomb. So you should understand that all that hype that was created in 1998, first by India and then by Pakistan, of having achieved heights of technological superiority, all that was a lie. Today, the making of atom bombs is much, much easier than, let's say, making a nuclear reactor or making an aeroplane. An aeroplane, something like an Airbus A300, is at least 50 times more complicated than making a bomb. That's why, unfortunately, proliferation is an issue that's going to remain with humanity for a very long time. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming here. I think we've had a good session.